What if I told you that the people narcissists forget the fastest are the ones who loved them the most? And the people they can't stop obsessing over are the ones who simply stopped caring. Think about that for a second. Not the ones who begged, not the ones who fought, not the ones who tried to prove their worth, but the ones who went quiet, stood tall, and walked away like their peace mattered more than the narcissist ever could. Because here's the shocking truth nobody talks about. Narcissists don't chase love, they chase control. And the moment they realize they can't control you, you stop being a person in their life and start becoming a puzzle in their mind. A mystery they feel compelled to solve, a loss their ego cannot accept, and that's when you become unforgettable. Narcissists do not become fixated on every person who crosses their path, despite what many people assume, because their attention is not driven by genuine emotional connection or romantic depth, but by something far more self-centered and fragile, their ego. Every interaction, every conversation, every relationship is unconsciously filtered through one silent question inside their mind. How does this person make me feel about myself? And if the answer is neutral or ordinary, you simply fade into the background of their life like white noise, easily replaced, easily forgotten, because you never touch the core of their self-image. They may flirt, charm, or pretend interest for convenience, entertainment, or temporary validation, but there is no real psychological hook. The people they remember, the ones they replay in their thoughts, are the ones who stir their ego in some intense way, either by making them feel incredibly superior or painfully challenged. If you admire them too much, praise them endlessly, or depend on them completely, you feed their grandiosity and they may keep you around as a steady source of supply. Yet even then, it is not obsession, it is utility. Obsession begins when someone disrupts their internal balance, when a person mirrors back something they cannot easily control, predict, or dominate. The moment you stop reacting the way they expect, the moment you withhold approval, question their behavior, or show that your self-worth does not rely on their validation, you create tension inside them. That tension scratches at their ego like an unresolved itch, because now you represent uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the carefully constructed image they protect at all costs. They start analyzing you, watching you, trying to decode you, not out of affection, but out of psychological self-defense, because your independence silently says, they are not as powerful as they believed. To a narcissist, that feeling is intolerable, so instead of moving on like a healthy person would, they mentally circle back again and again, attempting to regain emotional control in their imagination, replaying scenarios where they win, where they dominate, where their ego feels safe again. Which is why the people who affect them most deeply are rarely the most loving or available, but the ones who unknowingly challenge their sense of superiority, shake their certainty, and force them to confront the uncomfortable truth that their power has limits. The strongest trigger for a narcissist's obsession is not love, not chemistry, and not even attachment, but the sudden and terrifying experience of losing control over someone they believed belonged to them. Because control is the foundation of how they feel safe in relationships. A narcissist does not bond through empathy the way emotionally healthy people do. They bond through dominance, through subtle manipulation, through shaping your thoughts, reactions, and choices until your behavior becomes predictable and centered around their needs. When they can predict you, they feel powerful. And when they feel powerful, their fragile ego relaxes. This is why they test boundaries constantly, provoking you, withdrawing affection, creating drama, or giving and taking validation, because each reaction you give confirms that they are still steering the emotional wheel. If you argue back passionately, they feel in control. If you cry and chase, they feel in control. Even if you fight them, as long as they can make you react, they still feel superior. But the moment you stop responding the way they expect, something shifts. When you calmly detach, when you stop explaining yourself, when you no longer seek their approval or fear their rejection, their entire psychological structure begins to wobble. Suddenly, their usual tactics don't work. The guilt doesn't hook you. The silent treatment doesn't scare you. The charm doesn't pull you back. And this is deeply destabilizing for them because it forces them into unfamiliar territory where they cannot predict the outcome. To a narcissist, unpredictability feels like weakness, and weakness feels like danger. They start questioning themselves, replaying interactions, wondering why they cannot influence you anymore, and that uncertainty eats away at their ego far more painfully than rejection ever could. Rejection at least gives them a story where you are the problem, but loss of control gives them no clear narrative, only a quiet realization that you have stepped outside their reach. That is why they become restless, why they check up on you, why they attempt to reinsert themselves into your life, because they are not chasing connection, they are chasing the restoration of power. What looks like longing is often just an attempt to regain dominance. And what feels like their attention is often just their ego scrambling to fix the one thing they cannot tolerate. The fact that you are no longer emotionally tethered to them and therefore no longer controllable. Indifference is the one response a narcissist is least prepared for, yet it is the one response that wounds them the most deeply because unlike rejection or confrontation, it offers them nothing to fight against, nothing to twist, and nothing to feed their ego. When you reject a narcissist openly, when you argue, criticize, or call out their behavior, you may think you are pushing them away, but in their mind, you are still emotionally engaged, still invested, still reacting, which means they still matter to you. And that alone gives them a strange sense of power. Even anger can feel like admiration to them because it proves they have influence over your emotional state. A heated argument allows them to play the victim, to manipulate the story, or to escalate the conflict until you are exhausted and they regain control. Confrontation gives them energy, gives them drama, gives them a stage on which they can perform, but indifference strips the stage away completely. When you respond with calm neutrality, when your voice stays steady, when your eyes no longer search for their approval, when you neither defend nor attack, you send a message that quietly devastates their ego, the message that they are no longer significant enough to affect you. For a narcissist, being hated is still being important, but being ignored feels like being erased. It creates a hollow space where their sense of superiority used to live. They try their usual tactics, perhaps a sarcastic comment, a guilt trip, a sudden burst of charm, or even provocation, yet nothing lands because you simply do not react, and this absence of reaction feels to them like shouting into an empty room. Without emotional feedback, they cannot measure their power, and without that measurement, they feel small and uncertain. This uncertainty gnaws at them relentlessly because their identity depends on external validation, on seeing themselves reflected in other people's responses. When you become emotionally still, like a wall they cannot penetrate, they are forced to face something they fear most, the possibility that they are ordinary and forgettable. That silent realization is far more painful than any insult you could throw at them, because insults can be dismissed or attacked, but indifference offers no target, no proof of relevance, only the cold suggestion that they simply do not matter anymore. High self-worth and firm boundaries create a psychological barrier that a narcissist cannot easily penetrate. And that barrier is precisely what makes someone appear unconquerable in their eyes, which paradoxically fuels their fixation even more. A narcissist moves through relationships expecting access, expecting compliance, expecting that with enough charm, pressure, guilt, or manipulation, they will eventually bend the other person to their will. Most people, without realizing it, leave small emotional doors open, doors built from the need to be liked, the fear of conflict, or the habit of over-explaining themselves. And a narcissist slips through those openings effortlessly, testing limits, crossing lines, and slowly training the person to tolerate more than they should. But someone with genuine self-worth operates differently, not loudly or aggressively, but quietly and consistently. They do not beg for approval, they do not chase validation, and they do not feel compelled to justify every decision. When something feels wrong, they simply say no. When a boundary is crossed, they calmly step back. There is no dramatic speech, no emotional chaos, just a steady refusal to tolerate disrespect. This calm certainty is deeply disorienting to a narcissist because their usual tools stop working. Guilt does not hook you. Flattery does not seduce you. Intimidation does not scare you. Instead of reacting, you remain centered, as if their behavior has no authority over your inner world. To them, this feels like trying to grab smoke. The harder they push, the less control they gain. Your boundaries silently communicate that your time, energy, and attention are valuable resources, not things they are entitled to, and that message challenges their core belief that they deserve dominance over others. The more they fail to influence you, the more their ego interprets you as a challenge that must be solved. They start watching you more closely, trying different tactics, attempting to crack the wall, because in their mind, everyone has a weakness, and the fact that they cannot find yours becomes maddening. Your self-respect becomes a mirror reflecting their lack of control, and that reflection unsettles them profoundly, turning what could have been a forgettable interaction into an unresolved psychological puzzle they cannot stop thinking about. Because the one person they could not bend becomes the one person they cannot forget. Narcissists chase people who stop supplying validation because the sudden absence of that emotional fuel creates a psychological vacuum they cannot tolerate. And this vacuum feels less like a simple loss and more like an unresolved wound to their ego. At the beginning of most relationships, a narcissist carefully conditions you to provide steady admiration, attention, reassurance, and emotional responsiveness, and they grow accustomed to this stream of validation the way someone grows accustomed to oxygen, barely noticing it because it is always there. Your compliments, your concern, your effort to fix misunderstandings, even your attempts to please them all quietly reinforce their sense of importance and superiority. Over time, they begin to expect it, to rely on it, to assume that no matter how poorly they behave, you will still circle back and feed their need to feel special. But when that supply suddenly stops, when you no longer praise them, no longer chase, no longer explain yourself, no longer react with emotion, the silence hits them like withdrawal. It is not just disappointment, it is disorientation. They start to feel smaller, less certain, less powerful, and they cannot understand why. Instead of processing the loss in a healthy way and moving forward, their mind becomes stuck on the person who used to provide that validation because the story feels unfinished. In psychology, unfinished emotional experiences create loops, and narcissists are especially vulnerable to these loops because their self-worth depends so heavily on external feedback. Without your attention, they cannot regulate how they feel about themselves. So their thoughts keep returning to you, replaying memories, imagining conversations, wondering how they lost their grip. The more unavailable you become, the more valuable you seem, because scarcity magnifies desire in their mind. What they once took for granted now feels like something stolen from them. This is why they often resurface suddenly with messages, apologies, or dramatic gestures, not necessarily because they miss you as a person, but because they miss what you provided for their ego. They are trying to turn the emotional tap back on, trying to restore the steady stream of validation that kept them feeling powerful. Your absence becomes an itch they cannot scratch, a question they cannot answer, and that unresolved feeling keeps them mentally tethered to you far longer than genuine affection ever would. Emotional detachment removes a narcissist's power because it quietly dismantles the very mechanism they rely on to influence, manipulate, and control others, which is your emotional responsiveness. And without that responsiveness, their strategies collapse like a machine with no electricity. A narcissist studies emotions the way a chess player studies moves, constantly observing what triggers you, what scares you, what excites you, and what makes you seek their approval, because every visible reaction gives them information they can use later. If you get jealous, they provoke jealousy. If you fear abandonment, they threaten distance. If you crave validation, they give it and take it away. Each emotional spike becomes a lever they can pull to steer your behavior, and as long as you are emotionally entangled, they remain in control of the rhythm of the relationship. But emotional detachment changes the entire game. Detachment does not mean coldness or cruelty, it means inner stability. A state where your sense of worth and calm no longer depends on their words, moods, or presence. When they criticize you and you simply acknowledge it without defensiveness, when they withdraw and you do not chase, when they attempt to provoke you and you remain steady, they suddenly lose their map because none of their familiar buttons work anymore. It feels to them like pressing switches that no longer turn on the lights. This lack of influence creates panic beneath their confident exterior because their identity depends on feeling impactful and dominant. If they cannot move you emotionally, they begin to feel irrelevant, and irrelevance is the one thing their ego cannot tolerate. They may escalate their behavior, becoming more dramatic, more charming, or more aggressive, trying desperately to get some reaction that proves they still matter. Yet your calm neutrality keeps reflecting the same message back to them, that their power over you has ended. In that moment, the dynamic flips completely, because the person who controls their own emotions controls the situation, and the narcissist, who once seemed intimidating, is left grasping for influence that no longer exists. Your detachment becomes a quiet form of strength, a shield they cannot pierce, and the realization that they cannot reach you the way they once could becomes an unsettling reminder that they were never as powerful as they believed, leaving them outside your inner world with no way back in. So when you step back and look at the entire picture, a powerful truth begins to emerge, one that completely changes how you see narcissists and, more importantly, how you see yourself. Their obsession was never about love, never about destiny, never about some deep emotional bond they couldn't escape. It was always about ego, control, and the desperate need to feel significant through you. The people they forget are the ones who chase them, the ones who overgive, the ones who try to prove their worth, because those people are easy to manage and easy to replace. But the ones they cannot stop thinking about, the ones who quietly live rent-free in their minds, are the people who stand steady, who know their value, who set boundaries without drama, who stop supplying validation, and who master the rare art of emotional detachment. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding. When you stop explaining, you stop performing. When you stop seeking their approval, you remove their power entirely. And in that silence, in that calm self-possession, the entire dynamic flips, because the narcissist is left powerless, staring at someone they cannot influence, cannot predict, and cannot conquer. That is what unsettles them. That is what fascinates them. That is what keeps them obsessing long after you have moved on. Which means your greatest strength is not fighting harder, arguing louder, or trying to win their game, but refusing to play at all, building such deep self-respect and inner stability that no one can hook into your emotions without permission. Because the moment you become emotionally self-sufficient, the moment you realize you do not need their validation to feel whole, you step into a kind of quiet power that no manipulation can touch. And ironically, That calm, grounded independence is the very thing that makes you unforgettable in the mind of someone who only understands control, proving that the less you try to matter to a narcissist, the more untouchable, mysterious, and mentally unforgettable you become.